So today thank you. So today we are joined by 4 esteemed panelists who are going to be helping us talk about this topic. And before I introduce them, again, as a moderator, I have to make sure that we have indeed a huge following on social media. So I'm going to invite you to follow us on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. I think our Twitter profiles are AIRA, and maybe the supporting team would help me put this on the channel just in case you want to raise questions on those platforms as well, or share what we're discussing here on those platforms as well. So today I have such an able panel before me, and I think I'm just going to mention them and give them a minute to introduce themselves each. So if I mention you, you're just welcome to say your name, probably where you work and such like things, just a minute of introduction. So I'm going to start with Angeline, because I know you were amongst the first people to arrive in the call. So Angeline, please introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, where you work, etc. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Catherine. My name's Angeline. I am the AI project lead at CIPIT. CIPIT is a research center and think tank based in Nairobi, Kenya, and we really focus on conducting evidence-based research on IP, ICT, and all emerging technologies, and using the data collected from that research to inform our policies. And I'm really, really grateful and honored to be invited to be a panelist at this talk. So thank you.
Welcome. And for our second panelist, we have Mark. Mark.
Hello, everyone. Very nice to be with you, and thank you so much for this kind invitation. My name is Mark Rotenberg. I'm the founder and president of a group called the Center for AI and Digital Policy, and our goal is to evaluate and assess the policies and practices of national governments in the field of AI, and to assess the alignment as against human rights and democratic values. We have just this week published the second edition of our big report, which I will be talking about in a few moments. And we looked at several countries on the African continent to look at recent developments with AI policy.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark. For our third panelist, I'm going to invite, and I really hope I don't butcher your name, Carlos, Juan Carlos, I hope.
That's perfect. Thank you, Catherine. And thank you to the African Internet Rights Alliance for the invitation to participate in this talk with this very well-formed panel. My work is in Derechos Digitales. We're an NGO working in all things human rights and digital technologies for all of Latin America. I serve there as executive director. I work with a team of people from different areas of knowledge all throughout the Latin American continent. I am based here in Santiago de Chile, where our main offices are, and I'm delighted to be here with you all. So thank you.
Thank you. Ashnat, I'm not sure if Boye from Paradigm had joined us. I think he has. So Boye, I'm going to give you the final opportunity to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Boye Adegoke, and I work with Paradigm Initiative. Paradigm Initiative, it's a member of the African Internet Rights Alliance, and we are a Pan-African organization who work to, advance digital rights and inclusion in Africa. We have regional offices in at least 6 countries in Africa, in Zambia, Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, Cameroon, and Zimbabwe. Yeah, so we work to advance digital inclusion and digital rights, and we've been member of AIRA from inception. We have also conducted research on artificial intelligence, looking specifically at Senegal and Nigeria, and it's a pleasure for me to be on those calls and to share our knowledge and expertise on the subject.
Thank you so much. So Angeline, I'm going to start with you because yesterday I attended your call where you were talking about AI and you had various stakeholders, and you were talking about AI and data protection, and you have some specific questions that you were answering. And so I want to invite you to maybe share what has been your work on the continent, just give a more in-depth talk about what you've been able to do and what are maybe the ethical considerations that you've been able to encounter when it comes to AI. So Anjali?
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. Let me share my screen, if I may. If someone could enable that for me, please.
Permission granted, you can share.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. Please do let me know if I drop out at any point or I freeze. My internet has been especially unpredictable this last 3 weeks, so we'll see how this goes. So I will be giving a brief overview on the current landscape of AI in Africa, opportunities, obstacles, and ethical considerations going forward. To begin with, I'd like to touch on what AI is. I'm sure most of us on this call know, but just in case. So artificial intelligence refers to any computer systems that are created to mimic human intelligence, which just really means that they can evolve. They can evolve in their ability to solve a particular problem. So there are two main components that go into creating AI. The first is an algorithm. This is just a fancy way of saying a string of words in code written to tell AI what its function is. And then the second thing that we need is to train this AI, and that's usually accomplished using data training sets, right? So you write the code to tell AI or to tell your computer system what the problem is, what it's trying to fix. You give it a set of data to train it to identify patterns, and then it evolves from this point, right? So that's what AI is in a nutshell. Now, Africa as a continent came to this whole AI playing field a little late, comparatively speaking. So if we compare Africa to Europe or the UK or even China, or the US, in terms of development and adoption of AI platforms, we are the newcomers. But with that said, we do have a vibrant AI ecosystem emerging on the continent, and this is both in terms of development and adoption. Primarily, we're still consumers of AI tech, and we tend to import this tech, excuse me, from elsewhere. But we do have a couple of startups, more than a couple really, on the continent that are developing AI tools to solve African problems. And they do this again using the same two things, algorithms and data training sets. Unfortunately, most of the algorithms that we use are open source, meaning that they've been kindly developed and provided by other organizations, so put on the internet or elsewhere for free, and the developers use that, and then also the data training sets tend to be non-local data sets. So for example, if you have a startup and it wants to develop a tool to detect plant diseases in tomato crops in Africa, most likely the source code was open algorithm source code that was modified. And again, most likely the data sets that were used to train this algorithms were obtained likely from the big three. So the EU, the US, or China, which is good and bad. So, everything has two sides. So the opportunities we have for AI use on the continent are as varied as the challenges we have in utilizing them. So generally what we're finding in our research is that AI platforms are developed to provide solutions for lacking infrastructure or insufficient labor or limited access. So for example, in the health field, if you are living in a rural area, you might not be able to access a medical facility easily. an AI diagnostic tool would be a great help in a scenario like that, right? So you could input your symptoms and then get a diagnosis. Or if you are a farmer, a smallholder farmer, you're living in a remote area, you maybe don't have people who will help you within the value chain. So to get your goods from the farm to the marketplace, an AI platform could aid you with this. So really, we're seeing most of the motivation in developing these tools is to provide stopgap measures for places where we're lacking. The main sectors where we're seeing this development occur are in agriculture, in health, in education, and in fintech. So agriculture, we actually have last time we conducted a mapping exercise of AI application tools on the continent, we had over 65 AI platforms just in this one sector. And this covered every part of the continent except Central Africa. And the agricultural AI apps ranged from applications providing farmers with information on their soil or with information on best irrigation practices, or for providing help in marketing their produce, or even helping them obtain small loans. We also had AI tools in the health sector. This were mainly diagnostic, and there were not as many as in the agricultural, so that's still an up and coming area. We had educational AI tools. We have Mshule in Kenya, which is really big. I know there's one in South Africa, and you'll have to forgive me, the name escapes me right now. I know it starts with a Z, but I cannot for the life of me think of it. And we have AI platforms also in fintech, so providing loans, providing financial help, financial information, that sort of thing. Now, we do have this development occurring, we do have adoption occurring, but there are great challenges in Africa that are hindering, I think, rapid progress in this area, in terms of innovation, one, and also in terms of penetration of AI platforms on the continent, right? So the first I'd like to discuss is lacking digital infrastructure. I think this is across the board. You know, some areas are better than others, but I think if I can speak in terms of numbers, what we're seeing in Kenya, for example, only 75% of the people have any kind of access to Wi-Fi or the internet. And that is either because they don't have the infrastructure in terms of the data pools, I can't think of the words, to access these tools. Or again, finances also play a role in limiting development and adoption. So finances in that you really can't access the benefits of AI. You can't access platforms or tools that enable you to use AI if you don't have the physical means to buy things like smartphones or laptops or computer. So that, I think, is a big barrier in the penetration of this technology on the continent. Finances also play a role in the development process. What we're seeing or what we're finding is that a lot of times the financial resources available to startups are really from international money pools, whether that is private businesses or NGOs or government entities. Most of the financing is being obtained from abroad, and it is a small pool that is also made smaller because you are also now competing with international companies. We do have local private entities or local entities in the business sector that are getting a little bit more interested in AI and providing financing, but that's still limited and it's still fairly new. From what we're seeing right now, currently, government subsidization of this AI development process is nearly non-existent. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't seen any government really chip in or buy into the AI development process. The third thing that is an obstacle in having widespread use of AI or development of AI is our limited labor pool. So you do need to have very specific hard skills in developing AI technology, right? You need to be able to code, you need to be able to deal with big data, you need to be able to conduct data analysis, and while that talent pool is growing, it's still comparatively limited if we're looking at what you find in the States, for example, versus what you'd find here in Kenya in terms of AI development, AI developers, excuse me. Then lastly, issues of equity. And I listed equity and access, but I really should have been a little bit more broader. So access, also bias, all these things really hinder equitable, the development of an equitable AI ecosystem, right? So one of the main concerns that we have is that AI, rather than being a silver bullet that cures all that ails us, what it could really end up doing is help a specific few, and then really disadvantage a large majority of us, right? So it could end up it could end up widening already existing inequalities. So we did, CIPIT ran a mapping of the gender disparity in the emerging AI workforce in Africa, and what we found was alarming and disheartening. So there's a massive disparity there's a massive disparity in all sectors of AI development, whether it's AI applications being developed for the agricultural sector or for education, it doesn't matter. There is a disparity in all positions as well, from the most basic, low level, let me say, position to those who actually yield considerable power. You find a disparity, and I think maybe the most disheartening thing was that this disparity actually rose as you go up the hierarchy, the power hierarchy, right? Which is in line with a lot of what you find in tech, but still, it was kind of a little sad to see. So if you don't have women's voices, for example, being considered, taken into account in the development process, then any gender bias that might be innate in that type of technology will not be found, will not be identified in this process. So it'll carry on from the development, from the back end all the way to the end user. All right, so real quick, let me speak about governance structures, and then I will end with ethical considerations. And I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will speak a little bit more about this. AI, when we consider AI laws, or laws specific to AI, there really are none right now. So there are no laws governing source code, or there are no laws governing there are no laws governing the data sets compilation. There really isn't any law governing AI specifically. What tends to happen is the laws or policies that are in data protection acts, for example, those can be used to govern any AI tools that are getting into the market. there has been mandates and policies that have been put forth, either regionally or nationally. So the AU brought forth a mandate that stated that it would like its member states to consider AI in a broad sense, and they listed a couple of specific things they would like them to look into. I know Kenya had a blockchain AI task force that it created in 2019, I believe, to look into the issues of AI. We also have a national ICT policy that mentions something about AI, just saying, you know, if the government is using any AI tools, they would prefer that they create those using open source code and then make that code available to the public or anyone else who wants to use it. But again, no laws specific to AI on the books thus far. And then lastly, in this emerging AI ecosystem, we know it's developing, and since it's burgeoning, I think we're in good stead to have it develop in a manner that's all inclusive. And to do this, we would need policies that not only consider the commercial ramifications of these tools, but take into account ethical considerations. And when they are taking into account these considerations, I think personally, there are four main things that I would like to see them address. So one, issues of access. Access, if you don't have access, you don't have benefits, right? If you don't have access to these tools, you can't benefit from it. If you can't benefit from them, that means economically, you are shunted out of any progress that these tools will make on the continent. Socially, likewise, politically, likewise. So I think access is of paramount importance when we're considering AI processes, AI development and AI adoption. Equity is also important. So, okay, so we've made sure that everyone has access to these tools. Then we have to make sure that everyone is benefiting equally from these tools that they're accessing, right? So whether it is from a gendered perspective, if we have tools that discriminate one gender over the other, and this is not, I'm not speaking hypothetically. We have studies that have shown things like Google. I think Google tried to use an AI algorithm in its hiring process, and it found widespread discrimination in women against women's resumes rather than men's. So there's already data showing that issues of bias are nearly innate. Maybe innate is too strong of a word, but you know, nearly innate in most of these AI tools that are being generated. So I think we need to consider how we can make sure that it's a fair playing ground, and that's issues of that's addressing issues on equity. So again, whether it's gender or whether we're dealing with marginalized communities, we need to figure out how to make sure it's fair for everyone. Then there are concerns on data privacy. So AI is data. Without data, you cannot have AI. In that you need data to develop it, and you also have a massive amount of data generated from its use. We need to know how that data is being collected, how it's being processed, how it's being stored, how it's being utilized, if it's being transferred, then what are the laws governing that? And that all needs to be done in a way or done in a manner that protects privacy, right? Whether it's personal information privacy, whether it's health data privacy. So all that needs to be considered. And then finally, the issue of knowledge asymmetry. So I think one of the things I left out when I was discussing the obstacles facing AI on the continent is the issue of digital illiteracy. So if you are to use these tools, you need to know how to use them. And we see that digital illiteracy on the continent is at a much lower level than globally. So we need to have a way of addressing that. We also see that there is asymmetries in the types of knowledge that are out there concerning AI, concerning digital technologies in general, and concerning data. And the asymmetry here tends to favor those in power, whether it's in power, the conventional way that we think of power, like political power, or whether it's power in terms of economic power. So people higher up on the economic totem pole tend to know a little bit more about these issues and tend to be able to navigate this digital economy, this digital social sphere that we're creating a little bit better than those that are a little bit lower on the socioeconomic strata. And again, that just leads to disenfranchisement of those lower on the social economic strata, and that leads to a widening of this inequality gap that we have on the continent. So I think when you're creating any kind of policy, any kind of laws, that all these four need to be taken into consideration. And
Thank you.
that is
Thank
it
you.
for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angeline. I think I've picked up so many things from what you've said. So first you started talking about the development and of course that being data sets and the availability of data sets, and then you moved on to highlighting how AI is impacting different sectors of the economy, be it agriculture, be it fintech, and then pointing out the challenges that we're experiencing when it comes to AI in terms of capacity, in terms of data, in terms of gender disparities also, and what that means also for us going forward, which could be compared against probably what's going on across the continent and across different continents, for example, in Europe, where the government is making more investment in AI and more investment in education and more investment in coming up with a holistic strategy, and then now comparing that with what we have locally. But I want to invite Boye. And Boye, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to stress that we need to keep time, especially just because we have the rest of the other participants and we want to make this session as engaging as possible. So I'll give you 7 minutes and I'll really try to make sure that you keep time. I'll give you 7 minutes to just tell us, maybe following what Angeline has said and seeing that she's pointing out issues that are happening on the continent, maybe for you to highlight what have been your findings in the work that you're doing in the countries that you're working on, and just tell us what are your perspectives as paradigm on the issues of AI. Thank you. Boye, are you here? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. So Boye, your presentation, I'm guessing would be interesting because I saw you playing with hats, you know.
Yeah, I would keep it as short as possible since you've taken 3 minutes from my time. So I'll just try and see how I can just go straight to the most important issues. So the first thing I would love to talk about, okay, let me try and share my screen. I prepare the presentation so that you would also be able to follow me. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, okay, all right. So I just want to quickly speak to some of the findings we had from the research we did on AI, specifically on Nigeria. And one of the things we've seen is that African countries are, responding to developments globally and trying to also, lay a stake in terms of what is happening, and also trying to, jump on the train, etc., and all of that. And we've seen some moves that were, taken by Nigeria specifically in that regards. For example, Nigeria is probably the first country to institutionalize the National Center for Artificial Intelligence and Robotics. And the idea was that that agency was going to lead in the research and development of AI systems in Nigeria. But it's very important that I note that if before this, of course, there have been a lot of activities within the private sector, towards AI. Okay, Ashnot has asked that I put on my video. I'm going to put it on. I'm just trying to manage the bandwidth so that you can hear me well. But I'll put it on, then I'll put it off again, just for you to match the name to the face, especially for those who are watching, who are joining us for the first time. Okay, my video is on right now. So I was explaining earlier that Nigeria, established a Center for Artificial Intelligence and Robotics, which is a great thing, which is also an indication of, some sort of seriousness around, not being, backward with respect to the development of AI. But, some of the issues that have been highlighted by the first speaker are very, very relevant to Nigeria as well. And I'll get to that very shortly. But I just want to point out some of the positive things that has been done. I also wanted to mention that a state in Nigeria created a special ministry, like a government ministry on robotics and artificial intelligence, which I think is also a very great positive within that, that context. However, I also want to mention that there are about 75, as at the time of the report, there are about 75 private organizations in Nigeria, businesses, startups, etc., that are using or creating or adopting artificial intelligence systems in their work. So, of course, people have started adopting the technology, and we saw that this is particularly true of the tech startup ecosystem, private organization, businesses. They were beginning to embrace, artificial intelligence systems in how they deliver on their work, and this span across different sectors of the economy, from education to agriculture, and even in terms health services as well. Then quickly, there are also government, department, ministries that have mandates to regulate the use of AI across Nigeria. So we identified 7 of those agencies, or if you like, ministries of government. There's the Ministry of Communications and Digital Economy, Federal Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, the National Information Technology Development Agency, National Office of Technology Acquisition and Promotion, NCC, the Nigerian Communications Commission, Securities and Exchange Commission, and Corporate Affairs Commission. Now, while this looks good, the problem with it is that it also shows confusion, because when you have too many, agencies of government regulating the same thing, or, putting their feet forward to say we are regulating this. And I would explain this further when I'm wrapping up in about 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah, so I think it's also very important for me to highlight that the resort to AI and other digital technologies, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, also created new vulnerabilities for the data of Nigerians to be, commercialized, weaponized. Therefore, issues of algorithm bias, loss of privacy, lack of transparency, and overall complexity in getting Nigerians to understand how they are interacting with AI require policy considerations, definitely. And also, lastly, let me quickly talk about the, regulatory environment. Nigeria has a Nigeria Data Protection Regulation, which is a regulation that was initiated by one of the agencies of government that I referred to earlier. And also they created a guideline for the management of personal data by public institutions in Nigeria. But the point I really want to take out of this, and the analysis that we can take from this finding, is the fact that within the Nigerian context, there have been clear moves, both from the public and private sector, with respect to advancing the course of AI in Nigeria. But the challenges we have seen is that we don't have a coordinated approach. I did mention earlier that there are about 7 agencies that are public institutions that we have seen trying to lay a stake to leadership, to try to say we are the one who run things or coordinate or regulation around the subject of AI. That's confusing. Also, I did mention earlier that Nigeria established a National Artificial Intelligence and Robotics Center. That's supposed to be a step in the right direction, but there is also a lot of challenges around that, because I personally did make some moves to engage with that agency. And one of the problems I saw was that for an AI agency, if you need to engage them, you need to write a letter, a physical letter. You cannot reach out to them, through any electronic communications, whether emails, even when I called, I was able to get a phone number to call. When I called, I was still asked to come and write a letter to the coordinating agency, which is the NIMDA and all of that. And I feel that for for an artificial intelligence agency, that shows that that shows clearly that it's more like you're putting the cart before the horse. It shows that the supporting structure that should support that kind of system is not in place. It shows that the readiness, there are some readiness that are required to set up a system like that. It shows that they are not in place. It shows that, of course, there is a desire somewhere to kind of be a leader in the AI policy or AI, regulation in Africa, but it has not been matched with the same level of competence that I think it requires. And when I say the kind of leadership that we are talking about, I mean that you need to put a lot of things into consideration. The first speaker dealt with that very aptly in terms of the regulatory frameworks that need to be in place, in terms of data governance management system that needs to be in place. So yeah, while we can lay claim to some wins, there is also a lot of problem with respect to, getting supporting system in place, data governance system, data governance structure, regulatory framework. I did mention that there is a secondary legislation, but there is no data protection authority, for example. There is no primary legislation around data protection in Nigeria. There are bills at the National Assembly, and anybody who follows Nigeria development knows very well that there's really no interest in enacting a primary data protection law. There is just this activities of government that seems to, in my opinion, shows that government is not serious about creating a very strong, data protection regime in Nigeria. And we all know that when we talk about artificial intelligence, as much as a lot of people tend to see it as something new, something sexy and all of that, it fits off development of other kind of system, such as number one, the data protection regime system that I did mention about it, because artificial intelligence depends on data. So the quality of data plus the quality of data governance is very key to enforcement of artificial intelligence systems. So when you don't pay attention to all of these things, they become problematic. So those are some of the things I would love to highlight at this stage. Maybe when I come later, I can also speak to the research I personally conducted with the center, the center on AI and digital policy that Dr. Mark leads. I'll be able to also speak to some of my findings in that research when I come back later. But at this point, let me put a stop to it so that I don't go beyond the time that Kitchen has allotted to me.
Thank you so much. First, thank you for keeping time. And I think that my upstairs neighbor is maybe playing with a blender. So I apologize for noise, if there's any noise at the background at this time. I think that you've spoken a lot towards the lack of a coordinated approach to regulation and to regulation within maybe Nigeria, having pointed out so many institutions that are also responsible for the management of AI. And so now I want to bring in Mark, who works for the center that you alluded to, just to give us, so Mark has experience with probably regulation in terms of AI regulation with UNESCO. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing different approaches in terms of maybe the African Union coming up with policies on data governance, and then maybe wanting to highlight what would that look like for an African approach towards AI regulation. So I just want to invite Mark to probably give us what his perspectives have been in terms of AI regulation and the work that he's done, and pointing out what specifically we need to concentrate on. Mark?
Here we are. Okay, very good. Well, thank you again so much for the opportunity to be with you today. It really is an honor, and nice, of course, to see Boye again, who worked with us on this big report that we just released this week. And I'm going to say a few words about the report, which provides an overview, I think in response also to the earlier panelists and Angeline's comments. What we are trying to do through the center is to provide a basis to evaluate national AI policies and practices through the lens of human rights, rule of law, and democratic institutions. If you spend some time in this field, you will see fairly quickly that there is a lot of data that's being provided about AI, but it typically measures such factors as investment levels, patents obtained, research papers published. And I think those are all useful metrics for evaluating this important industrial sector. But I share very much the commitment of AIRA and the member organizations, which is that as we think about new technologies, we want these technologies to truly be for the betterment of people. And if they lead to extreme concentrations of power, if they diminish human rights, then of course we have a problem. The difficulty is, how are we going to detect that? How will we know as these problems begin to emerge on a comprehensive basis, on an analytic basis, and not simply on an anecdotal basis? So this is the origin of our report, AI and Democratic Values, which we released this week. And we had developed a methodology. I'm just flipping through the website now, but we developed a methodology to evaluate policies and practices using 12 metrics. Some of them are familiar. We ask questions such as, has a country endorsed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? And then we ask the question, is the country implementing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? And we took that approach as well to the OECD AI principles, which were drafted and released in 2019, and probably among the most influential frameworks. I'm going to pause here for just a moment to share with you also some of the key findings from our report. We do this on a global basis, on a national basis, but to give you a snapshot picture of where I think we are today in our global understanding of AI policies, following the metrics I briefly outlined. We did a rating and ranking based on these narrative reports, and we placed Canada, Germany, Italy, and Korea at the top. It's an interesting grouping of countries, but I will say that among the key characteristics that we rate highly are meaningful opportunities for public participation in the development of national AI policies. Many countries have prioritized AI policies, but not all countries are doing a great job inviting public participation, which we call the public voice, into the policymaking process. So that's the first question we ask. We look at the defense of traditional fundamental rights, questions of equity and discrimination. We think this is a very important foundation as AI systems are deployed. They can create opportunity, they can drive innovation, they can also replicate bias and widen disparities of wealth and opportunity. So part of this, of course, follows from fundamental commitments. We look at the data protection infrastructure, and this is an interesting issue, particularly with regard to the African continent, where we have seen in the last few years some movement toward establishing national privacy laws or putting in place a privacy commissioner. We think those are important indicators of favorable AI policies because, of course, many of these systems are based on the collection and use of personal data, which can be appropriate and can help drive innovation in areas of medical care, but can also lead to discrimination in areas such as employment and education and housing. And you really do need a data protection institution with proper authorities to make sure that personal data is being used in appropriate ways. So these are the key factors that contributed to the high rankings for Canada, Germany, Italy, and Korea. We also called attention to the most significant AI policy highlights of the past year. I'll talk a little bit more about the UNESCO AI recommendation, which we think is a very positive development. I mean, it is an interesting moment in the field of AI policy. There's a lot happening, but truly governments are making commitments now to a positive vision for AI. We think those commitments are important to understand, that they should be recorded and they should be upheld. I mean, we should expect governments to comply with the commitments that they make. And the UNESCO AI recommendation, I would say, is a very important global commitment now from 193 countries. We follow, of course, developments in the European Union, where much of the regulatory activity is taking place. The EU has introduced a comprehensive risk-based framework known as the EU AI Act. Council of Europe is moving forward with a proposal for what could become the first global convention on artificial intelligence. And actually, the Council of Europe is an interesting organization because it provides the opportunity for both member states and non-member states to ratify those conventions. So you could imagine countries in Africa supporting a Council of Europe convention in support of AI and human rights. We are following the implementation of the OECD AI principles, which uses familiar phrases such as fairness, accuracy, and transparency. We were actually pleased to see this year the G7 leaders meeting in the UK. They have, as you would imagine, a long list of issues, global issues to consider, but there are actually a couple of paragraphs in the final communique from the leaders of the G7 calling out the problem of AI bias and urging more robust transparency. And so we viewed that as very favorable. We think there needs to be much greater transparency with AI decision making. Of course, the process of automated decision making, that's not new. I mean, computers have been with us now for many, many years. The particular problem with AI is that many of these decisions are becoming much more opaque, much less accountable, much more difficult to replicate. And the practical consequence is that organizations, whether private businesses or government agencies, make decisions about people which they really can't explain or defend. I mean, they say, well, we have a large data set, and the large data set has been carefully reviewed, and based on our processing of the large data set, which, by the way, we don't fully understand, we're quite certain that this is the correct outcome. And, you know, I have to say, frankly, it's just not a satisfying way to understand how decisions are made about people. So this call for algorithmic transparency, we think, is very important. And again, this is one of those statements where we do want to hold government leaders to their words. If they say they value transparency, which we certainly do, we'd like to see that implemented in practice. Here in the US, you know, we've had some battles with our own government. There's been a lot of secrecy surrounding the decisions on AI policy. I mean, the tech companies do have a lot of control over the political process, and the practical consequence of that is that people, civil society, academics, smaller businesses are not given the opportunities to participate in decision making that we think they should be given. But that's changing, I think, and this is a favorable development, which we did note. So the Biden administration has been more open, inviting more people to join the discussion, talking about democratic values, which we think is important. We follow also the alignment between EU and the US as two of the three big AI regions. If there's, you know, agreement, we would consider that to be good. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. You know, it's fascinating also, we study closely what's happening in China. And I would say, to the credit of the Chinese government, they have moved forward regulations, both for data protection. They passed the personal information protection law last year, and they have new regulation and recommendation algorithms. Some of these laws actually look quite familiar. The Chinese privacy law looks much like the European Union's GDPR. The recommendation algorithm regulation looks very similar to some of the proposals currently being considered by the European Parliament. But we do have concerns about the independence of the evaluation of these techniques. I mean, it's clear that under the Chinese form of government, there's a effort to maintain the authority of the current government, which we think is at odds with the type of openness and pluralism that AI systems should support. We also look at the issue of lethal autonomous weapons. There was a real push over many years for the United Nations to adopt a convention to limit, or better, I would say, would be to prohibit the use of lethal autonomous weapons. It appeared that we were getting very close in December of last year, but unfortunately the negotiators failed to reach agreement. The clock is ticking on this issue. It's just too much money and too much government research is being directed toward the process of automating warfare. And we believe the UN needs to act sooner before that problem is truly out of control. And then finally, I would say the big issues for us in the AI field also concern the so-called red lines. I mean, you can talk about the design of systems that are more open, more fair, more transparent, more accountable. The question is, do you actually have the ability to say with regard to some AI systems, no, we simply want to and should prohibit those systems? And so we've watched the work of NGOs in Europe and Africa and Latin America and Asia, speaking out in particular about the use of facial recognition as a system of mass surveillance. I mean, it's one thing, of course, to have facial recognition to, open your iPhone. It's an entirely different matter if facial recognition is being used to monitor people in public spaces. So these are the, the highlights, and there's a lot more available at our website. There are the country rankings with the 12 metrics. We had a very nice panel discussion, and you'll see our rating methodology. And I just wanted to just close the opening here by extending an invitation to the participants in the panel. As I mentioned, Boye has worked with us in the past, but happy to work with others as well. We really do seek to understand what's happening with AI policies and practices around the globe. We did reports this year on Rwanda, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa to try to understand the deployment of AI systems, and also to begin this assessment process to make sure these technologies truly are used for the betterment of society.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. I've seen questions in the chat asking for a link to the report, but I think that has already been provided. I think that you've given very good comments or very good insights on sort of the work that you've been doing at Center for AI in terms of highlighting the need for human rights assessment of also the AI policies, as well, moving beyond investment or other economic parameters. And I think one of the things that you've mentioned that struck me was, is it transparent? And then number two, is it publicly, does it encourage public participation, or does it encourage participation from others in terms of the policies and how we're making these policies? So I think at this moment, right before I invite all of you for, I think I could just open the panel discussion now by beginning to invite Carlos. Again, really trying to make sure that I have the correct pronunciation of your name. Just to give us maybe as a question as I open up the dialogue between all of us, and I also encourage participants to right now begin to give their questions on the chat. Carlos, maybe Mark has given us a perspective that's coming from an assessment of different countries, and I would like to ask for your own perspective maybe on AI regulation within Latin America. I think it's also an aspect of Global South, and so it's like an avenue where we can have a South-to-South lining on this. So maybe you would want to give us your perspective on Latin America regulation and AI. Welcome, Carlos.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Catherine, and thank you also to my fellow panelists for their previous presentations, because they serve a lot to frame what's been happening in Latin America. And it's true, as Catherine just said, there are a lot of commonalities. So many of the things that Angeline was saying beforehand, those apply to Latin America as well. Global South, developing countries with strong investments in mining and financial technologies and agriculture, and also health. These are areas where AI is indeed showing some signs of further investments, or at least the impulse by governments in Latin America to introduce more AI technologies in what can be read as a continuum of the usage of digital technologies as a tool to encourage economic development. However, from those concerns and from those policy priorities by governments into catching up with the AI discourse around the world, there are a few things that need to be taken into consideration. And a lot of them have to do with what Mark was just saying from the report from the center. Some of those have to do with the policy questions that the governments are trying to address through national initiatives. In the case of Brazil, through an AI draft bill that is in Congress, that is being put under serious questioning, but also the national policies in Colombia and Uruguay, the new national AI strategy from Chile, what's been previously published in Mexico and Argentina that has not necessarily been followed up a lot. That there are certain areas where policy priorities and policy questions have been raised. For instance, in what are the ideal investment tools? What are the ideal avenues to educate and create capacities in the countries to solve some of the gaps in the knowledge that these countries have, but also societal challenges, like how do you include and how do you promote larger participation? And from the perspective of civil society organizations, such as Derechos Digitales, such as our partners in Al Sur, which is not unlike AIRA in many ways, as civil society and academic organizations working on digital policy, the concerns are aimed at, first, the usage of AI as a tool for policy where there might not necessarily be a sufficient study, a sufficient assessment of its necessity, and to the extent to which these tools can be deployed in a way that they impact human rights. So those concerns from a Latin American perspective are both in terms of the economic side, but for civil society organizations, it has a lot to do with, so what do we do about the negative impacts, about the fact that deploying technological tools might actually have a difficult impact or a difficult significance to different groups. We have conducted a lot of work on AI policy in a link that I just put in the chat, that has to do with both national strategies, but also some case studies on deployment of AI in the public sector, where we have seen that the uptake of the AI as inevitable future has been, by governments, has been a strong point of contention, mostly understanding that these technologies may not necessarily have the proper framework, the proper legal framework, the proper institutional framework, and separately that there might not be necessarily sufficient assessments of those impacts. So for us, aside from the economic perspectives, we are very much concerned about issues of inequality in infrastructure, in access to resources, in capacities, but also knowledge gaps in terms of what kind of procurement, what kind of transparency measures are produced by governments, what kind of sufficient frameworks for data governance are used, and especially and echoing in part what the democratic values part of Mark's presentation was about the inclusion and participation in the processes of designing, developing, implementing AI, but most of all on the process of decision making about the usage of those systems. So in essence, there's a lot of commonalities with the African continent, with the African context. We have many differences between countries, with all of the countries trying to catch up to the international discourse and the enthusiasm behind AI, but at the same time, a lot of concerns about how our current legal frameworks might not be good enough to face the human rights concerns that the usage of these systems have, especially when those are deployed by the government, when those are deployed by public entities, not just in terms of surveillance and facial recognition technologies, which is, of course, one of our big areas of activism for Derechos Digitales and many other organizations, but also in terms of the usage in areas of health, in areas, for instance, in the allocation of public funds, for instance, in the case of allocating police funds in different sectors of the region. But that's one of the things that we are looking into, and that's why we are conducting the research that I linked here in the chat. These are the main concerns at the moment.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And I hear you when you say that we have a lot of commonalities and a lot of areas that we could learn from each other. And I've seen a very interesting comment from Marianne based on what you've said on the chat. And I'll just invite you to look at that before I give her an opportunity to speak. But now I want to be fair to Boye, whose minutes I consumed while I was trying to give everyone a fair opportunity to be heard. So Boye, you mentioned that you would like an opportunity when you come back to just highlight what has been your research. I've seen you've posted some comments or some links to your research in the chat. I'll just invite you to talk about that, talk about your work again and your research again, and the discussions that Paradigm has been engaged in influencing AI policy in Nigeria.
All right, thank you, Catherine. So, I mean, I think the most interesting thing for me is that if you look at all the panelists and all the points that has been made, except for, apart from the global perspective that Mark gave, but you would see commonalities in terms of the issues. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to quickly just speak to my evaluation of the AI index in Nigeria, because what we did with the center is that we did an AI index for a number of countries across the globe. My colleague who is also on this call was also part of that work. To be clear, he wrote the report for South Africa, yes. So my evaluation, for example, of what's going on in Nigeria is, number one, that Nigeria is here to have a national policy or national strategy for AI, although in paradigm initiative engagement with the government through the National Information Technology Development Agency, they have said they are already working on one, but then that poses the next problem. If the national, if the Agency for Technology Development is working on an AI strategy and you only get to know because you asked that why don't you have an AI strategy, then you see the problem of lack of public participation in the process, lack of stakeholder engagement in the process, because you shouldn't have to ask. If the government was doing that as a major stakeholder in the tech policy ecosystem in Nigeria, you would have expected that your opinion should have been such, you would have expected that there should be some kind of request for public participation comments. And that leads me to the next issue. The next issue is that the AI policy that we are developing, in whose interest? So the problem with developing a policy in a closed room is that it's going to be pushed by certain interests. It can be the interest of the big tech. It can also be the interest of just the government, who wants to have as much power as possible in terms of controlling the tech ecosystem in a country. So that leads me to the next problem, which is the fact that there is a lack of public participation, stakeholder involvement in the process of developing this, AI policy. Another thing I want to speak to, which I had already hinted on when I spoke earlier, is also the kind of data protection frameworks that we have in place. I think I listened to a presentation on approaches to data protection, and 3 approaches were identified. Approaches to data protection ecosystem can be from a human-centric approach. It can also be from a control-centric, something that looks like what you have in China, whereby the government has a lot of control over the data protection frameworks, whereby you are focused on sovereignty, just trying to be able to control who does what and all of that. But also there's also a business-centric approach. A business-centric approach is when you are more interested in having data work for businesses, having data work for business making decision. And that is where I think artificial intelligence comes in. What I would have thought, and what has been paradigm initiative position, is to focus a lot on human rights centric approach, to data governance or to data protection. That is not what we are seeing. What we are seeing in Nigeria is more of, number one, control approach, which is like all this digital sovereignty approach, whereby the government wants to have as much power and control data system in the country. And if you have any doubt, a few weeks ago, you'd see that the Minister of Communication and Digital Economy in Nigeria was saying that only the law enforcement agencies have access to public data in Nigeria. What that means is that the law enforcement in Nigeria have direct access to those public data. So what happens to researchers? What happened to business? People who need to, use data for businesses. What you are seeing is that government is more control about digital sovereignty. Now, let me walk back from all of that in terms of how that relates to the conversation we are having. It relates to the conversation we're having in the sense that the deployment of artificial intelligence, while it seems like a great thing, how much can we do with it when we are having a system whereby government think that this is another opportunity to have so much control over the system, so much control over the people? It makes the people vulnerable. It makes the civic space vulnerable. So therefore, one of the recommendations we made is that government must pursue a human-centric approach towards artificial intelligence. The same way we have argued that's also the right approach for data protection in the system. And it's very important to say this because most African countries have very poor human rights record. And why it is the young people that are driving the adoption of AI mostly in this part of the world. Government, in asserting itself, is not focusing on how to create the right ecosystem, the right regulatory framework, but it's rather busy with trying to use it as a system, as some form of control, which I think anybody who cares about where social justice or human rights should be worried about. But then, on the positive side, it is very important to emphasize the industry, the enterprise of young people who are developing system, etc., for AI to thrive in Nigeria and the rest of Africa. What I think should be the next step is a lot of advocacy push in terms of ensuring that there is more public participation in the process, in terms of ensuring that we get the regulatory system right, so that the regulatory system create an enabling environment whereby we protect human rights while at the same time pushing for a very great and excellent use of data to create AI system that work for the people, not just for the interest of the government in power, which we know that it's very risky, especially when you look at trajectory and the history of governance in most African countries. So lastly, I want to speak to a very noble project that I came across in my research, which is called the NAS AI project, which was, being developed at that time to be able to use artificial intelligence to classify parliamentary bills from the National Assembly with the aim of making them more accessible. I just spoke about public participation, and I think that if citizens can have access, through artificial intelligence to what goes on the floor of the parliament, I think it's a major development, and I think it's an example of positive use of AI. I would like to see this kind of development more and more. But finally, I think there needs to be a lot of attention on the regulatory system around the adoption of AI. There has to be a lot of carrying the people along, making sure that we leverage on expertise that exists, not just in government, but also in the private sector, but also in the civil society space. There is a reason why the internet governance model is a multi-stakeholder model. And we need to continue to maintain that system if we are going to get the best out of the system. And if the system is going to work for the people and not just for the interests of government, and of course, the interests of the big tech companies. Thank you.
So, sorry, I started speaking even before I unmuted because Boya spoke so passionately about having people concerned and knowing what's happening at the floor of Parliament. And I think I was really reading the chat, and I can see some very interesting conversation between Mark and Rothenberg. And so I don't know if I think I will invite Mariana to just give, I wanted to ask her, a specific comments have been addressed by Carlos, but I'm sorry, by Mark. And I think Mark might probably be able to speak to the situation, to what I can see happening between the chat, just to sort of give some context, and then we can invite Mariana to add on to specifically the context in the country she's mentioned. I think it's Brazil.
Thank you, Catherine. I excerpted in the chat a few paragraphs from our report because Carlos had begun by talking about the situation in Brazil. And this is the type of material that we hope to provide to digital rights groups and human rights defenders around the world. As you all are involved in AI policy, we want to have an accurate, objective, authoritative report of what's happening in the countries to help inform the advocacy efforts. And the situation in Brazil is actually quite interesting. As we understood, there was an effort to push forward legislation in Brazil, but there was very little public participation. It was really being driven by the government and the tech industry. And the practical consequence, as the advocates and the academics looked more closely, is that a lot of the current rights that exist in Brazil under the Constitution or under the data protection law would have effectively been diminished. And so, fortunately, there's a pause. There's now an opportunity for more public participation before that legislation is enacted. And I think this is a good illustration of the point I made at the beginning, that in the development of national policy, there has to be a formal process where the public is given the opportunity to participate and make recommendations. And that process has to be meaningful, and governments have to make documents available online so they can be reviewed and discussed. We don't object to the participation of the tech industry. Obviously, they have a big interest in this legislation, but most important has to be the participation of the public, because it is the public that is ultimately impacted by these systems, which will make decisions about hiring, and they will make decisions about education, and they will make decisions about border crossings, and they will make decisions about policing and sentencing. So all of that needs to be assessed, and the public needs to be given the opportunity to have its say.
Thank you so much. And Carlos, I can see your hand up. So I'm not sure if Mariana is able to speak, but Mariana, I'd probably like to also invite you to give us more of your comments that you posted as Carlos, even as Carlos comes to speak. Carlos?
Yeah, I do not know the context as well as my colleagues in Brazil, including my co-director and my policy director here at Derechos Digitales. However, we have been somewhat embedded in that discussion because we were also critical of both the bill, but also this process of creating this commission has been subject to criticism. It's essentially a trap to have, I mean, I'm exaggerating here, but it can be seen as a way to calm down those criticisms without necessarily addressing the issues of representation. There's still a majority of views from certain sectors or certain geographical areas of Brazil. There's still not a lot of inclusion and representation in this commission, and there's still the mandate to come up with an updated text as a proposal for the bill. So basically the process still continues on, regardless of how much criticism might have led legislators to go in a different direction altogether. As Mark was saying, it's very important to have participation from different stakeholders. This includes, of course, the tech sector. However, it is still one point of large debate and discussion, how much representation and how do you properly represent the different groups that might be affected by these frameworks, especially when they are criticized by being focused on the aspirations of certain industries and not necessarily the larger view of the country. So the technical or the framework questions then lead up to the democratic and more broad policy questions, as the democratic part of what Mark was saying becomes a big part of all of technological developments and all technology related development in the country. But I'm sure that Mariana can speak to a lot better details than I can.
Yeah, and I can see Mariana is ready to speak. And after Mariana, I'd like to ask Haman to be ready to ask his question. So Mariana, please welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your questions and comments. I can't turn my camera on right now, but I can speak a little on context, about this commission and the whole process of passing an AI legislation. The thing is that this was being conducted in a way that was not participatory at all. Like the level of participation was non-existent. So the attempt to create a special commission, including in terms of the procedures in the House of Representatives, was a way to kind of slow down the process, because civil society, especially in the end of last year, was not being able to counter the efforts being made by big tech lobby. So basically we were losing, and that means that the legislation that was going to be passed was not very protective in terms of rights and also of accountability of both governments and companies deploying AI systems. So, but I agree with Carlos. There is a big issue because Brazil, as you know, is a very unequal country with lots of institutional racism and problems of discrimination in general. And this has been seen in concrete examples of AI systems, facial recognition, predictive policing. So yes, the commission is formed basically by people with a background in law. It's a jurists commission, and this has been criticized because AI is not merely a legal issue. There are lots of other sectors that need to be involved in this discussion. So this is one point. And the other is that is an entirely white commission. There's not a single non-white person. And this is preposterous in Brazil. And since the main problems with AI in Brazil are related to discrimination and racism, this is a big issue. But it was considered somehow positive by civil society in the sense that we were completely unable to compete, let's say, with big tech lobby. And now we have some time to deal with the issue of AI regulation, and even to push for an expansion of the commission, the inclusion of other members, public hearings, and other participatory instances, because even the national strategy for AI that we already have, and it's not legislation, it's more of a like standards, policy standards by the executive. It had some sort of participation, but still it was not very meaningful. So we are working towards building a stronger civil society participation, and not just from digital rights organizations, but other organizations that also are affected by AI systems. It's a very big challenge. It's we are worried, but we are working to kind of make this better for everyone. So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for being able to give us such a vivid description of what's going on. And I think I want to tie this to Harmon's question. Let me just see if I get this name correctly. And I'll have to read out the question just in case for the recording and what if it's posted. So the question is, do we have a case? So do we have a case of a study country or a region that has excellent AI laws and policies? And what makes good AI law and policy? And I think I will invite Angeline to come and answer this question, just based off what we're hearing from different regions within Africa, and within also the global South, right? Like Brazil, the fact that maybe there are lobbying, there are maybe private companies with bigger budgets who are lobbying for this regulation, but then there are also civil society organizations that are lobbying for more inclusive and more human rights centric AI regulation. And so, Angeline, I know you also mentioned issues of gender disparity, and now Boye has mentioned issues of lack of public participation even within African parliaments. So Angelina, I want to invite you to answer this question on what do you think makes good AI law and good AI policy?
All right, so in terms of a region that has good AI policy, I actually think Mark might be a little better suited to speak to specifics on that. The EU is leading a lot of AI governance structures. In Africa, again, we don't really have AI legislation on the books. The EU did tell its member states to, hey, go out there and look at AI and look at its benefits and look at ways of mitigating its risks. We do have a couple of nations on the continent that have said that they have AI strategies that they're creating. Kenya is one. I mentioned the blockchain AI not workforce, a think tank that they created. They also have similar strategies in Botswana, Zambia, Egypt. A couple of countries say that they are looking at AI strategies, but nothing has really come from that. And I'm not sure whether it's that the work is ongoing and it's not ready to be released into the public, or there are issues of opacity, that everything is shrouded in such mystery that we have no idea what is being done or what is not being done. In terms of what ideally should be done, I agree with everyone that say that the process needs to be a lot more inclusive. We need to have public participation. We need to think of it in terms of a human-centric approach rather than a data-centric or a commercially driven approach. I would like to raise one point that I think maybe has not been discussed that much in terms of the issue of public participation. I think the public can't participate in a robust and constructive discussion on matters that, one, it doesn't really know that much of, and because it doesn't know that much on issues of data or issues of AI, it doesn't realize the impact that data can have on their day-to-day lives, whether it's social, economic, or political. So I think we also need to talk about, well before we herald public participation forums, we really need to talk about educating the public on issues of data, on issues of AI, why they're important, why they should be concerned about them, and how they can actually be integrated in this governance process. And I think that's something that no one is really trying to address, whether it's public in the public sphere or by private industries. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, so I think in terms of also understanding what maybe is excellence in designing an AI legislation or AI policy, I think I want to invite Boye as well, Boye and Carlos. So I'll split this question into two. So Boye will answer, no, sorry, I meant Mark and Boye. So Mark would answer, is there a yardstick for excellence in AI policy? No, wait. Oh my God, I'm really confused. So I'm sorry. So Mark would answer the question about the regions, right? And which regions have specific, the question that was not answered before, and which regions or which places could you say have like maybe par excellent or things that we should be looking at? And then Carlos can answer, is there a yardstick for excellence in AI policy? And again, Boye would answer, how do you ensure protecting data privacy law in the cost of assessing quality data to train algorithms, especially in light of what Angeline was talking about in terms of African data sets. And so I really want the data protection question to be answered by Boye, and the yardstick on AI policy to be answered by Carlos. And Mark to give us also as well, could answer this and give us specific regions in terms of AI legislation and AI policy.
Thank you, Catherine. Just very briefly, I posted first this survey that was provided by UNESCO last year, which I think is a helpful overview of AI policy developments across the African continent. So I would certainly recommend that. And to your question, which regions are doing well? Of course, it was interesting to us that we found in North America and Europe and Asia leaders in the field of AI policy. I would say among the African continents, the African countries, based on our survey methodology, South Africa is probably ranking most highly right now, mostly because of its advances in data protection and a national AI strategy. But there is progress being made, and it's encouraging to see. I also believe that the UNESCO process will provide incentives for governments to move forward national AI strategies that are human-centric and trustworthy. So that will be a big part of our report next year.
Thank you so much. Carlos?
Yes, very briefly as well, in respecting everyone's time. I do not believe that there's an ideal AI policy or regulation that we can mention right now. However, aside from the better aspects of some of which are highlighted in the report that Mark was mentioning, I think that probably the best thing we can aspire to is that it's having in general policies that reflect the priorities of our peoples, of our nations, and that means that the processes to enact AI policies should reflect the aspirations of the people, that should be properly represented, that should be open to democratic intervention, that should be also respectful of human rights. Therefore, it's not so much about its content, probably, but that content needs to be an outcome of a process that reflects all of that participation and all of the knowledge that it's being created, and also the aspirations of the people of our countries. And hopefully that also reflects higher aspirations of collaboration, of inclusive development, of representation, and also about collaboration between different countries. Thank you.
Boye, keeping it brief as well.
Yeah, I'll try as much as possible. Yeah, so how do we ensure we ensure privacy, data protection in the deployment of AI system? I think my view would be that people, interested stakeholders, must continue to demand for the right thing to be done. And I take inspiration from what has happened in Kenya with respect to data protection laws and implementation of digital ID system. Despite the fact that Kenya had a law, there was a very, very strong civil society ecosystem that was demanding for more. before the implementation of ID system, there was a demand for the need to, establish a data protection authority to appoint a data protection commissioner. I think that's a lot of inspiration that I think other African countries can learn from. We should not just go with the flow. And I gave an example of Nigeria, for example, that is shying away of enacting a proper data protection law. I expect actors in the space to continue to speak until Nigeria does the right thing. And I think that's what should happen overboard. There needs to be that continuous demand that the right thing should be done, that the strong regulatory system should be put in place. We should not just accept anything that is thrown at us by the government. If we have to use litigation like they did in Kenya, we should use it. If we have to use engagement, positive engagement, but if that is not working, we should explore litigation. But the point is that until we have standards that we think can help us to compete globally, we must never give up, must continue to make demands of the authorities. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to give the final opportunity to Otto, and I don't know if the speakers have a closing remark. It will be 10 seconds short, just to keep time. If we're 1 minute over time, I think that's the last thing. So Otto, you have 30 seconds to speak to the document, and then we just get the closing remarks from the speakers.
So thank you so much, Catherine. I don't want to take up much time. Basically, the African Commission came up with that resolution to conduct a study on AI and associated technologies. I think one of the things that we've observed in Africa is that we are also a recipient of technology and a recipient of standards. And I think that we have to deal with, because it really affects the quality of the standards that we implement, the absorption, and the follow through. So this for me is an opportunity to really influence a human rights approach to any regulation or policies that might be made. But much appreciation to the panelists. Back to you.
Thank you, thank you. So I'll start with Carlos.
Yes, just as a final thing, I think the AI presents an opportunity to understand our democratic processes well beyond what the usage of technology is, as well as to raise the difficulties in addressing the many inequality gaps that we have as countries, as whole nations, and also within our societies. But I hope that this opportunity can also be taken to look into the future in a more comprehensive and collaborative fashion. Thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation too.
Thank you, Boye. Boye might have slept. Mark?
Thank you again so much for the opportunity to participate. It was a wonderful discussion. And again, on behalf of all of us at the center, I just wanted to extend an invitation to those with AIRA to join us and help us as we try to understand and assess the growing impact of AI on our societies. It's enormously important. Changes are happening quickly, but I believe that through good research and advocacy, we will be able to make a difference. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate in the discussion.
Thank you. Angeline?
Yes, again, thank you so much for having me on this panel. As a last closing thought, I just want to say that AI has the opportunity to really solve many of Africa's greatest challenges, but I think it also has it can widen existing inequalities. And I really liked what Juan Carlos said about AI being a reflection of a nation and its people's priorities. And I think that's really what we should keep in mind if it's talking about development, or when we're talking about utilization, or we're talking about the governance structures, that AI should be a mirror of the people that it's serving. Again, thank you so much for having me on this panel.
Thank you. And finally, Boye, if he's still here.
Yeah, I'm here just to say thank you for the opportunity to speak on this panel and the work that the AIRA is doing. I'm proud to be a member of AIRA, and I look forward to the next conversation that AIRA will host. Thank you.
Thank you. So once again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much to our participants and to our panelists. Please remember to check out our website, aira.africa, and our social media pages as well. And we hope to see you in our next call. Thank you to our supporting team, the team at Akijul. Thank you so much, everyone, and we hope to see you again.